I need some traction. You need some traction.
Hey everybody, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI and Traction Conf. Super stoked to have Partho here, head of product at Bananatag, telling us how to build your product right the first time by empowering your product teams. Prior to Bananatag, Partho was in product at Unbounce and some other awesome, great companies. And I've been a big fan of Partho for a very long time. Today's webinar is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with Founder Institute, BCF Ventures, and Lazaridis Institute. Partho, take it away.
Thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to kind of talking about building out empowered product teams and trying to strive to that, building the right thing the first time as a whole. Before we get started, this talk is, I presented it a couple of times. Really, I found that it's really, really important, especially for founders that are going through scale and maybe they're going through high growth right now at their companies. I found that this talk can really help them. It's really dedicated to product managers and product owners. I have an asterisk there beside the product owners that we'll talk about a little bit. It's also really useful for product designers, product marketers, really anyone that's playing some form of a product role at your company, and developers. Of course, they have a huge part with building out products. So the next piece I'll just kind of talk about is we're going to talk a little bit about product as a whole, but also how it plays a role in different agile frameworks. And how the idea of building out empowered product teams can sometimes come at odds, but it doesn't have to with different agile frameworks. So the agile frameworks that we hear a lot of course, some form of lean, some form of agility, maybe that's Scrum, which of course has become very, very popular in the last 10 years. Maybe it's Kanban, maybe even a mix of the two, Scrumban, we hear that a lot. And then SAFe, which stands for Scaled Agile Framework. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then there's so many other models that kind of mirror different parts of Agile, like some form of a Spotify model that's become very popular in the last 5 years. Either way, what we're going to talk about here is building a really kick-ass empowered product teams. So a little bit about myself. Hi, my name is Partho. As Lloyd said, I'm currently the head of product at a company called Bananatag. We're an internal communication platform, really dedicated to enterprise organizations and improving comms within those orgs. We're a B2B SaaS platform, and I also on the side teach at BrainStation. I teach product management, agile development. And prior to that, I was kind of director of product and leading product at teams at companies like Unbounce, MEC here in Canada. Please do connect with me on Twitter. I'm at Product Partho. Try to brand myself a little bit. And on LinkedIn, it's /Product Partho. Anyways, our agenda for today. So we're going to spend about 35 to 40 minutes. I'm going to do a bit of a talk here on kind of what and who and why we should be talking about empowered product teams. I'll then dive into the how, which I think is not talked about as much as the why and what empowered product teams are in the world right now. And then we'll have about a 15-minute kind of interactive session where we play a little game I like to call MVP or not MVP, and everyone here can use the chat to kind of answer when we go into that section. So before we begin, a bit of an elephant in the room here. For this conversation and this deck, I'm going to be using the terms product management and product ownership synonymously. I believe that they are one and the same. So if you're a product owner, I'm going to relegate you as a product manager. If you're a product manager, I may call a product owner. They're the one and the same in my opinion. Now, big caveat to that is if you are a partial product owner, which I kind of call, if you're not doing the entire spectrum of product management from kind of ideation and thinking about ideas as a whole, and then taking an idea, discovering it, figuring it out, living in that problem space, and then validating that idea before it goes into a delivery cycle. The rest of this presentation you may not like, but you'll, I think, get a lot out of it no matter what. So I'll just call that out here, and there'll be more topics on this a bit. But to start with, let's talk about, what is an empowered product team? Why is it important? And really, who's it for? Because it's not for everybody. So the first thing here is, empowered product teams are really product-centric teams that should be long-lived and empowered, right? Able to move on their own. And typically, they'll build out objectives that are set by the team that should align to your company's objectives. This could be via things like OKRs or maybe a company roadmap, maybe both. And really, empowered product teams have become pretty synonymous with product-led growth. It's become a bit of a staple with that, and product-led growth has become a lot more popularized in the last year or so, really synonymous with a lot of value-based tech startups, a lot of SaaS companies, and a lot of high-growth companies as a whole. And so everyone's kind of looking at empowered product teams as this mecca. And really, the output of great product teams are kind of exactly that, great products that succeed in our marketplace, and not feature factories that typically ruin customer experiences. Some of you may have heard the Empowered Product Team from Marty Kagan's book, Inspired. We'll talk a little bit about some stuff that's inspired, but dive a little bit more into the how. And, Marty Kagan proposes here that the purpose of a product team is obviously to solve problems in ways our customers love, yet work for our business. And obviously that sounds so great, and that's what we should all be striving to. But I've seen a lot of companies stumble in trying to build out teams that go and do this. And so we'll talk a lot about that. Now, empowered product teams typically will either own an entire product or a segment of a product. And the team itself should be wholly responsible for its own learnings, its measurement, and its development. And I find that this is actually one of the hardest part of building out these product teams as a whole is how do I figure out what segment and how to segment products to make sure that a company can kind of own and rely on their teams to move the needle forward. And so segments can be, owning a part of a customer journey. That's become really popular. Maybe you have, a growth team, an engagement team, and maybe even an offboarding exit team. There's so many different versions of this, but it can really, really be powerful to have a team that's really looking at a certain segment in your customer journey. And what's really cool is you can have more than just a typical product team of, product manager, developers, QA. You can introduce marketing into that team. You can introduce data scientists into that team. So that's pretty cool. Another very popular way is kind of owning a specific vertical. Maybe you have a central product and a platform, but you then have very different verticals that have specific needs. And so you can have teams that kind of own those verticals. And another very popular way is kind of a particular theme or value that your customer is getting. And so they are really kind of honing in on iterating and making sure they evolve the value of a certain product as a whole, and really focusing on the customer problems rather than the solutions that are really driving to that value. Empowered product teams, though, one thing they're not is really teams that are working on a single feature or specific features. That's the way that we call them out. That's the X team, they're working on that feature. Or they get stood up for a single project and then they get torn down. Product teams are meant to be long-lived so they can evolve as a whole. And then, of course, this is another one I see, especially through scale, teams that work together because of a tech stack problem or a code-based challenge, whether you've changed coding languages or you have to work, with a certain code base for one part of your product. Unfortunately, that's a really bad way of trying to empower your product teams because there's this huge limitation. So another way that I've seen it, because I mentioned Marty Kagan and Inspired, which has become very popular, I have a list of resources that I pull for this deck at the end, so everyone will be able to kind of read some awesome books. But this is another great way that I see empowered product teams can also be known as modern teams. And for anyone that may know Eric Ries, he built the Lean Startup. His latest book, which came out a couple of years ago, The Startup Way, kind of called out really three key components that I like to call out here. Number one, he kind of says an old-fashioned company is really founded on steady growth and prescriptive management to really perform in short bursts, where a modern company is, founded on sustained impact by innovation in long-term results. Secondly, he calls out that, a lot of older fashioned companies kind of look at specialized roles that work in silos and then have like a baton pass kind of in a waterfall process, rather than a modern team that's really more cross-functional and work together through experiments and iterations to achieve something greater. And the last piece being exactly that an old-fashioned company kind of operates these larger programs while a modern one kind of operates rapid experiments. So in the end, who's it for? Because it's not for everybody. I believe that an empowered product team is really any team that's working on any long-lived product that needs to continuously deliver value incrementally should be an empowered product team as a whole. But the opposite is also true, that it's not for everyone, and we need to call that out, that it's not for everyone. And so the big pieces that we see is there's many cases where building a team around, this idea and mantra may not work. The ones that I see the most is really service-based companies that are maybe a digital agency, and you're really working on kind of one small slice for a customer, and then you're pushing that out. Another one where organizations that may have a really large emphasis on professional services and are trying to get more billings through professional services. You may have more of a reactive roadmap where you have to do things for the pro services team. And so this model may not work for that. And then if you're a sales first organization and you have really reactive roadmaps because you're looking to build custom pieces for a specific deal, this might not be the model for you. I do have an asterisk here because I don't believe in that model. I believe that product managers and product teams should be building for value that customers are going to buy into and not specific singular needs. But there are companies that have this problem and this challenge. And then lastly, any incubators. If you are an incubator and you build out a lot of 1.0s and then you churn that 1.0 and maybe sell it off, this might not be the model for you. And that's important to call out. Empowered product teams have been really, synonymous now with a lot of product managers trying to kind of build these empowered teams. And sometimes, you might be trying to fit a circle in a square hole with this. So, but why is it important? Well, unfortunately for us, 80% of our customers still typically use 20% of our products. And a lot of the state of sector reports that you'll see on product management showcase reports from like Pendo and Heap and a lot of product analytic platforms that show, close to 80% of customers still use only 20% of your product. And then lastly, 90% of products in startups still fail within their first year. These are numbers that just haven't been updated in the last decade. And it kind of bears the question that there has to be a better way. And I think building empowered product teams is a good step in the right direction. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So how can we go about building these kind of empowered teams as a whole? There's been a lot of frameworks out there, and the frameworks themselves are pretty interesting as a whole. This one's really great in that this is modern agile. It kind of talks about trying to, build iterative processes that deliver value continuously by making, team safety a prerequisite, making it safe to fail, making it safe to experiment, and then making your users really awesome. You can use things like lean UX and lean startup principles in the experimentation phase. You can then, of course, try to rapidly deploy, and there's a lot that's kind of built into this framework. And this is just one of many. Another empowered product team framework, I called out Eric Ries's latest book that came out, I think it was 2016, the Startup Way, which had this framework here, which was really basically talking about how do you get ideas into the kind of delivery flow and make sure that you're not building the wrong thing and spending money and wasting money unnecessarily. Another version of this, which I won't dive into, is a little bit easier to see, was really talking about that kind of continuous innovation and continuous transformation that'll achieve high growth. So all this is to say that unlike Scrum or Kanban, for some reason we haven't really had an empowered product team framework that's kind of been the winner. This model here, which some folks may have seen, this was close to being kind of very popularized. This is kind of known as the Spotify model or the tribe model, which kind of highlights that you have a tribe that looks at a certain value area, and then there's a squad that looks at certain features, and then you have chapters to manage kind of different functions. Unfortunately, the challenge that I talked about of how to segment your product came into play, and that was really challenging. And what ended up happening was a lot of these teams didn't know what they owned, or they weren't really empowered, and we'll talk a lot more about that. They kind of were more known as feature teams as a whole. So continuing on this idea, well then how do we go about empowering product teams? Well, we need to recognize that if we're going to empower anyone, we have to hold them accountable. And that's a hard thing to do. So really, how can we hold the teams accountable? And this is a really interesting question. So I'm going to ask, the group here, and we've got a lot of participants though, but in the chat, maybe we can just get some answers and I'll call some of it out. But, on a Scrum team, if the wrong idea or wrong product is built, who should be held accountable? Any answers? We'll kind of wait on the chat here for anyone that wants to answer. So cool, one person says the whole Scrum team. Any other answers? The product owner. One person said me, that's great. One person said the Scrum Master. And another person said the founder. So that's great. That's exactly how often what I hear are, I get all those answers, product manager, product owner, a Scrum Master, a founder. Sometimes I'll get the whole Scrum team. Second question, I'm gonna move on to the second question here. On a Scrum team, if a project is delayed or the team's velocity is regressing, who should be held accountable? So I have one person that said all of us. So another person said the Scrum Master and PO. Another person said the founder. Another person said the team and the founders. And then lastly, I'll end here. It says the whole team should be responsible, but it can be useful to have a main owner. So, and then it says PM and product owner, interesting enough. So this is the interesting piece. It's really hard. Most folks on these teams don't know who's held accountable. And the challenge is, I believe it has to be the team. The team needs to be held accountable for them to be made empowered. But there's different parts to what they should be held accountable to. And the biggest thing that I think that they should be held accountable to is time wasted on low value work. That's so important as a whole. If we're wasting so much time on working on things that our customers don't love and don't want to use, that's the biggest piece. So let's dive into this a bit more. I think the product teams themselves can be empowered a lot more by getting clear objectives and singular focuses that typically should be aligned to a KPI and a team North Star. But it's so hard because that segmentation we talked about of a product can be difficult to do. But it's really important to spend time on making sure that your teams have these clear objectives so they can work together. When we look at the team itself, when we look at the kind of risks that the team need to make sure of before they dive into building something, Marty Cagan proposes these 4 risks as a whole. Number 1, value risk. Will people buy it? Will people choose to use it in the market? There's usability risk. Will people be able to figure out how to use it? Is it easy to use? And then feasibility risk. Can we build it with the time that we have, the money that we have, the skills that we have, and the technology that exists today? And then lastly, the business viability risk, which often gets so missed. Will the solutions that come out work for our business? Will sales be able to pitch it? Will marketing be able to market it? Will it make money for us? These are 4 questions that should be asked before anything gets built. And this isn't just on the product manager or the scrum master or the product owner. This is a team effort. Building products always been a team effort. It takes a village. And for that reason, we need to have this kind of balance between these 4 risks and this balance of power, that not just one person is taking control over all of it. And also there's not just a single kind of person that's accountable for it. The biggest piece here is that in the empowered team model, you'll typically hear of this idea of like a trio or a TPD. At our company, at Bananatag, we call these the Triforce groups and have a little fun with it. This is really the idea of having a tech lead, a product lead, and a design lead work ahead of time on ideas and in the problem space to figure out, is this idea going to work for our customers? Are they going to choose it, and can we build it? And then how, right? The how then transforms into the solution space, and that's when the entire team can be involved as well. And the idea is that this kind of team leadership group that lives on the team is able to make decisions around these 4 risks instead of other execs or command and control kind of hierarchy as a whole. And there's some good questions I'm going to get to. We'll have a Q&A kind of at the end, so we'll definitely answer some of these pieces. So because there's some great questions I can see in the chat. So on top of this, when we're thinking about how to empower product teams, we have to recognize that most of our teams live on one cycle, which is typically a delivery cycle. But when we talk about this trio or a group of folks, and that group can revolve, and you can have more than one designer, you can have more than one developer on it. The idea being that you can have a discovery phase and then a delivery phase, and those could be separate, and then we can finally separate the problem space from the solution space as a whole. And typically you'll have MVP tests that we'll talk about later on that validate that this idea will be purchased or chosen or used by our customers. And thus, when we go into delivery mode, we won't be wasting a lot of precious resources that the company has in our developers. So lastly, kind of before we go into a little bit more of the how, we're going to talk about some of the different types of teams that exist today, and then we'll kind of wrap up the how together. So today, we typically see a few types of teams as a whole. And there's kind of 3 main types that I call out. Number 1 is kind of a delivery team. Number 2 is what we often call feature teams. And then the 3rd one's kind of what we're talking about here, empowered product teams. But you may think that some of these teams are empowered, but as you'll see, I'll kind of squash that idea as a whole. So delivery teams, sometimes known as scrum teams or dev teams, they are typically, made up of some number of devs and QA. Maybe they have a scrum master if you're running Scrum, or a product owner if you're running Scrum. In this instance, what's really interesting is that the product owner is typically more a backlog administrator. And actually the product owner title was kind of made originally as owner to try to have more responsibilities than product managers. But for some reason, product owners now have typically been given less responsibility and less accountability as a whole. And they kind of get seen more as this backlog administrator. The worst version that I've heard of this is I've been told this by a couple of companies that I've consulted with, that they see POs sometimes as Jira monkeys and just building tickets and writing tickets for the development team. And really in this mode, that's all about delivering velocity, right? It's about the how and the solution and delivering output rather than customer value. It has very little to do with innovation and building out value to our customers. And it's unfortunately not very customer obsessed. And frameworks like SAFe do promote this behavior because they separate, the product manager and the product owner and the people that are talking to the customers and the stakeholders separate from the people on the ground. And that's just unfortunately doesn't really work in this model as a whole. The second version is what we call feature teams, which is interesting because they're very close to product teams, but these are also sometimes known as squads from that Spotify model that we talked about. And the great thing is they're getting there. They're kind of halfway there. They're cross-functional teams, which is great. They'll have product design and engineering. Some of them will have marketers and growth hackers, and that's great too. They are built to serve the business, which is also awesome. But the challenge arises at the end where typically this team is provided a list of features or projects to be built, usually via a roadmap or a backlog. And the problem is that the team did not curate those ideas and did not validate those ideas. That's the biggest piece as a whole, whether it's by the team or even the team's product manager. So it kind of looks and feels like an empowered product team. But when it comes to the actual role, especially of the PM, that's where it kind of falls apart. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. What we often see is the biggest difference here is it's hard to be customer obsessed on these teams because the items that they work on aren't curated by the team themselves. And that leads to feature factories as a whole. So when we look at feature teams and we look at product teams, the interesting things that we see is the product manager is really responsible, of ensuring value and viability in this product team. But now all of a sudden we've kind of stripped that away on these feature teams as a whole. So on a product team, the designer is typically responsible for that usability, and the UX and the UI of the solution or the idea. And lastly, obviously on a product team, the tech lead is usually responsible for the feasibility. So, these three roles in that trio we talked about are looking at these 4 risks and ensuring that they're not going to happen. And so on a product team, if that's what their job is, then this work should not be done up front by a management group or an executive team, but rather it should be done by the team themselves. And that's the big difference with feature teams. Because this team should do this in a really, really collaborative way. It should be intense. It should be heated. You're trying to discover an amazing solution to a problem, and you're not trying to dive into a singular solution. You're really trying to stay in that problem space and really validate what a great idea and a great product could be, or features for this kind of idea as a whole. And that should be done on that team or by that trio. And so that's how product teams are really serving the business. They're trying to solve those problems in ways that customers love and work for the business. Now, vice versa on feature teams, what we often see is that that's all done by some other group, that the responsibility of the value and the business viability, especially the business viability, is kind of more of the responsibility of a stakeholder group or stakeholders, or even an executive group that requested the feature in the first place. The idea is kind of that, if that executive or stakeholder goes and says, we should build feature X, then they really believe that feature X is going to bring some amount of value and that it's going to work for the business. But unfortunately, a lot of that is unvalidated. And we know this to be true because so many companies struggle with this and lose money and time. And unfortunately, a lot of companies fail because of this one point. It doesn't protect companies from their most precious resource in tech, which is the opportunity cost of development. So when we look at this and that product management or product owner role on the product teams, as I said, I'm going to call those things the same. And that means that great product management should be great product owners and for great product ownership. And the role of that product manager on this team, if they need to ensure that value and viability are enforced and that those risks are kind of looked at as a whole, then they have to have a deep knowledge of the customer. They have to understand data around the market, the industry, the technology that's available. But they also have to have an understanding of how the business works, from sales and finance and support and legal. And a lot of the times, this may actually include P&L statements. And a lot of the product managers I talk to don't ever even get to look at a P&L statement or understand how a P&L statement works at their company for their product line or the portfolio that they quote unquote own. And I think that this is kind of essential and non-negotiable in product teams for them to make good decisions on their own. Now, on feature teams, as I said, just to really hammer it home, that knowledge is really dispersed amongst different stakeholders and execs. And yes, sometimes you can have good conversations where the PM or the PO can bring that in. Sometimes, unfortunately, it never reaches the entire team as well. And that's where we see this product manager role sometimes becomes more of a facilitation and herding cats rather than getting a feature designed and delivered. And so controversially, sometimes I see this much more to being a project manager role, which is fine if that's what we're wanting, but we should call it that instead of a product manager role. And there's no better or worse, it's just different. Now, on the big piece here is that product discovery is typically done in a way, especially on the feature teams, that there's a little bit of design and usability testing. You know, you think of a solution, you have some design built, you test that design and mock up, and kind of determine whether or not the customer is going to like some predetermined solution that those stakeholders created for them. And that's just not empowerment. And so that product management role in product teams needs to really be able to do product discovery as a whole. And sometimes that can take some time. But it's important that this is done in a lean fashion, because otherwise we just lose trust in the format as a whole. So when we talk about getting product teams to become more empowered, you know, as you kind of said, the accountability has to be held as a whole. And this really does mean that you can't be beholden to just the exact stakeholder demands, but rather our customers' needs and providing value to our customers. And so the team needs to be as close to the customer and the product as possible. And the product manager needs to be right there. They need to be able to understand the business, the customer base, the market, and the company's objectives wholeheartedly. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've talked to a product manager who does not know, you know, what's the growth goals for this company, or what's the year-over-year goals, or what are we trying to get to at the end of this year? And that's just really disheartening. So to do this, I think we really need to be able to understand not just getting the team closer to customers, giving them time and space to do discovery, but also understanding how they can validate ideas earlier and more often in a leaner manner. So, you know, unfortunately, a lot of the frameworks, and I'll show a few here around product discovery, do look a little waterfall-esque. I'll show some right now. And I think for us to gain trust and empowerment in our companies, we need to be able to call out failures and successes a lot earlier than we do today so that we can build the right thing the first time. So it's like the mantra really being fail fast, learn fast, and even better, if possible, experiment fast and succeed faster. So I'm going to go through some frameworks quickly. This deck will be shared thereafter, and we'll have this available on my LinkedIn as well. And the idea here is that this book came out really recently. It was only a couple of months ago, actually. I'm not sponsored or anything like that, but it's just a great book for kind of experimentation on both discovery and validation. And there's a lot of other frameworks that have existed for a little while. And some of them, while can look waterfall, they're meant to be lean and they're meant to be fast. And that's something that we have to call out is if we're trying to focus on the problem space and defining the problem, then validating it, understanding what the market traction could be, and will people use it? Will people buy it? This prototype and test stage is still often so confused. And I think this is something that we have to dive a little bit more into. And so the last section I'm going to kind of come to a close here of all the talking I've done here so we can spend some time doing a bit of an interactive game, and then I'll take some questions from the chat and we can answer some of them. But to me, I think the big piece that we have to call out is that product management and thus product ownership really should be the life cycle function of determining what is the next thing, the right thing to build. I also call out buy or partner because those are options next in a fashion that minimizes risk for the entire company. So I'll say it once more. I think product management should be the life cycle function to determine what the next thing should be built in a fashion that minimizes risk for the entire company. And that big piece, I have no idea if it's true or not, because I said it out loud. I didn't get this from anywhere, unfortunately. But it does feel like that's where we're trying to get to with discovery as a whole, that you need to be able to call out what's the next thing to build and make sure that it's correct the whole way through. In a Scrum team, an agility team, or whatever you want to call it, in continuous development, I think developing things itself is simple if we all knew what to do next. If we had a genie that told us and forecasted that this thing is going to be a success, a lot of companies wouldn't worry about the maybe a little bit of extra time that it would take us to get there because they know they're going to get a success in the end. And that's why the big piece to call out here is that opportunity cost is just so expensive. And typically as a PM, you know, we don't often think of our own company as our investor. And I think that's what we have to start doing. You know, again, going back, if this is our job and that we have to call out and determine what's the next thing to go and build in a fashion that minimizes risk, well, then we have to propose and pitch this idea to our investor, i.e. our own company. And that's why I love looking at startups and the way that they pitch their company, because they're basically doing exactly this. They're trying to highlight to an investor, a potential investor, that I've got an idea and here's why I think it's a great idea. And here's the test we did to validate that. You know, will you buy into my company? So how can we do that? How can we validate these things and call out what the right thing to build is in a continuous manner that really increases trust in this process and allows us to be more and more empowered? I think I'm going to call out that it's that we have to improve our MVPs and our definition of MVPs. And I know we've probably, any product manager in the room is really sick and tired of hearing MVPs as a whole and minimum viable products. But I want to talk about it a bit more. And I want to talk about this idea of like lean idea validation and removing the idea that discovery is very waterfall or that it takes a long time. And you know, the truth is, MVPs have become a dirty word in a lot of companies. But I'll call this out that Eric Ries, you know, said this not too long ago. You know, as you consider building out your own MVP and your own minimal viable product, let this simple rule suffice: remove any feature, any process, or any effort that doesn't contribute directly to the learning that you seek. And I think that's so important. So I'm gonna throw some controversial things out here. And for anyone that does know me as in the room, you know, I definitely don't shy away from some controversy. So I think this image or variants of this image ruined everything. I think the idea of, you know, here's how an MVP and an iterative development cycle works. I believe in iteration. I believe in an iterative process. I do not think you can go back to a waterfall way where you're waiting for a one and done, you know, let's launch everything all at once. It's going to take too long. But the idea of a customer wanting something to get from, in this case with this image, I would assume the problem space is I need to get from A to Z faster, or from one place to another place faster. If they ask for that and they're looking for, let's say, a car in this case, and you develop a tire and you give them a tire, I don't think they're going to be very happy, right? And the other part of it, though, is would you be happy with the skateboard? I don't know. I personally wouldn't. And that's the kind of the problem, is we have to validate what's the best first version of this product as a whole, and not send out slices that are meaningless. I think this is another thing that kind of also hurt the piece. And it's kind of interesting that it hurt, because the big piece is I really believe in this model, build, measure, learn. Oh, absolutely, we need to build, measure, learn. But for some reason, the build here became translated to develop software. I don't know why that happened, but building something doesn't always just have to be we need to code something and build some software. Many times, yes, we do, but definitely not always. And that's where we're going to kind of get into this MVP and this interaction here, the game I'm going to showcase here. Just before I do that, I want to call out the MVP and the product part of MVP. I think the P itself has kind of made MVP the dirty word at every company. Because it's a product, automatically you think that it's something that's tangible, that can be sold, that it's something that's there. But really, when you look at what Frank Robinson, who coined the term, what he was trying to say, and even Eric Ries, when he popularized the term in Lean Startup, they were talking about MVPs in a way as a evaluation, right? A way to validate value and viability, and really de-risk an idea and pitch it to your company or to an investor to say, hey, I validated this idea. I really believe customers want this thing. They're going to see a lot of value in it. Will you invest more in this so that we can go and build it out further? And that's the big piece. Even Wikipedia defines a product that way, right? A system or an object that's made for available use through consumers, and something that can be offered in a market to satisfy or the desire or need of a customer. Basically something that can be sellable. But the MVP is often talked about as an evaluation tool. So I'm not saying we change the term. I've heard minimal viable evaluation, minimal viable experiments. We've also heard other terms like minimal marketable products and minimal sellable products. I'm not going to worry about all those coined terms, but from a product perspective, tying in the empowered product team idea, I think that if in our discovery phases, if we can come to the table with our pitches and our proposals, whether that's a PRD or a canvas of some kind, if we can come to the table and say, hey, we've done this test and we've evaluated this idea, and we believe that this is a great thing to invest in, then our second slice or the first slice of your product doesn't have to be a small thing that when your customer's asking for a car, you build them a skateboard and expect them to be happy about it. So we're entering the game now. This is kind of the closure of my presentation, the talks. I'm going to kind of set up, I'll explain the game as a whole. I'm going to give just two kind of examples here. I think we're good on time here. And what I'll do is basically I'm going to propose a scenario. We're going to show off what was kind of built. And then I'm going to get folks to answer whether or not they believe this is an MVP or not. All right, it's pretty simple. So the first idea here is what would be Dropbox. Imagine you're going back in time and you have this idea that you as a product manager or even a founder have an idea, and you want to be able to share items across multiple platforms and store them on the cloud. And you are trying to validate, obviously, and get people to buy into this product, but you want people to invest in it, right? You want them to believe that, okay, we need to build this thing, we need to continue to iterate on it, we need to evolve it as a whole. So here's the question, and I'll show a quick snippet of this video, and then I'll ask if folks on the call believe that this is an MVP or not. Give me 1 second. Let me press play here.
Okay, my name's Drew, and I'll be showing you a quick tour of Dropbox, which is a new way to store and share files online. What makes Dropbox different is that it just works, and there isn't any complicated setup or interface to learn. So let's get started. I've already installed Dropbox on a Windows PC and put a bunch of files in, and now I want to sync these files to my Mac. So to do that, I just installed Dropbox, and now I'm linking my Mac to my account. So in a second, my account will be linked, and you can see that the files that were on my Windows PC will start coming down. And what we're looking at is my Dropbox folder, which looks and acts like any other folder except for two things. One, these little green icons that indicate files are up to date. And two, anything in my Dropbox is synced across all of my computers and to the web. And you'll notice that when I make changes, everything syncs up pretty quickly. And as another example, I'm going to log into my Windows PC, where you'll see that not only are the changes for my Mac already here, but if I make another change to a file, so for example, this picture of a platypus, and then I hit save, the change begins uploading immediately. And when I go back to my Mac, the change is reflected in a matter of seconds. So the point is, if you've ever worked with multiple computers or carried around a USB drive or emailed yourself files from work, you can see this is a much easier way of managing your stuff. And we also protect you from the bad things that can happen to your files. So if I delete a bunch of stuff, we have this web interface where you can not only get to your files in case you're not at one of your computers. So here are the contents of my Dropbox here.
So I'll stop there. And again, I'll just quickly sum up the scenario. So you're a product manager or founder, and you are trying to get people to invest in this idea that you have and care about called Dropbox. Is this an MVP or not? So we have a couple of answers already. I'll wait for a few more. Most people are saying no, it's not an MVP. Can one or two, or all of you, anyone that answered, can you guys answer why is it not an MVP in your opinion? Too many number of features shown exceeds MVP. Some folks are saying that ideas can be conveyed with less dev work. There's too many features, and there's just too much that's going on way beyond that stage. And absolutely. So most folks are saying here that no, this is not an MVP. It's really, it's got Mac, it's got desktop, Windows, it's got a web platform. There's too much, it's too many multiple devices to show that it's an MVP. I have a couple of people that said it looks like more of a demo. They never validated that it was needed in the market information. So that's kind of a lot of folks. Steve said some pieces here, which is an interesting one, and I'll call that out. So I agree. I agree that if all this was built out, holy cow, yeah, that's a lot, right? That probably took them a long time, and now they're trying to figure out, is it built? But a little spoof. What if I was to say that this was a video, that none of this was built? It was a complete mock-up. There were designers that built this out and stitched it together to make it look like a real video. Now let me ask you and say that no development was done here whatsoever. You're a product manager, maybe a couple of designers. Let's say you're able to build this in a week or two. Is this an MVP? One yes. Anthony says awesome smoke screen. Couple of yeses. And that's the big piece, right? Here you've shown your investor, whoever that may be. Maybe it's your boss, maybe it's an exec stakeholder, maybe it's actual VC or investors. You showed them a concept and you validated that, hey, this is a good idea. And hopefully you're validating actually with customers, right? That you show this demo and you say, wow, we got so much interest. So many customers want to go and buy this thing. Here's an MVP. I often get folks say no as well. And we had a few people say no. And a lot of them will actually say no because even if it's a demo, and a video, then it's not an MVP. It's not a product. It's not something that's tangible that you can go and sell. But you as a product manager and that trio group that we talked about, the TPD, you know, if you're the developer on that team and you're the designer and the product manager, you've now just basically de-risked this whole idea that, hey, I want to go and build this thing, and we have a lot of interest in the market for it. You know, can we get X amount to go and build it as a whole? And that's your job as a PM on the discovery side. When you're validating an idea, you're trying to get that through. You know, that's why it's a great MVP, because that evaluation stage just got pushed through, and now you can figure out based on your burn rate and, you know, how much resourcing you have, you know, what your slices need to look like, you know, what can you release as a first version. You have to be very wary of when the market could shift so that you don't miss the mark. And that's where your iterative development processes exist. But there's no reason that you can't validate that ahead of time. So I'm going to show one more, and then we'll kind of open it up to some questions. So the scenario here is the same. You're a product manager. Maybe you work for a marketing automation platform, and you see a potential for a competitor to a product. Let's say in this case, Hootsuite, which manages social media. And so you got this idea named Buffer. I told you guys I love looking at successful startups as a good use case for product managers. And you have this idea, you're going to call it Buffer, and it's basically a competitor to Hootsuite. Maybe you're competing on price, maybe you're competing on something else. In this case, here's what was built. As you know, you basically have a website. There's two versions. The A/B test was done per se. You have one on the left where it gives you a quick value prop and step by step. And then number two, when you click on, I want to see the plans and pricing as a customer, it sends you to another page that says, oops, you caught us a little too early. We don't have this thing built out yet, but add your email if you're interested in signing up. The A/B test was basically the same thing. The first page kind of giving the value prop and the steps. And if you click on the plans and pricing, it would actually show you a pricing page. And if you clicked on any one of these pricing pages, it would show you that same page afterwards of, oops, you caught us early. You know, give us your email and we'll remind you when we're out of beta or when we're getting into beta, something around that. So this is what was built, an A/B test website, basically, 2 landing pages. So the question is this an MVP or not? So we got one no, got a yes. Maybe I can pick on these two folks. Got another absolutely an MVP. So for someone that said no, love to know why. Why is that a no to you? And then I'm going to call maybe someone that said yes. We've got Nareg or Mervin or Steve. Why is this an MVP to you? So Annabelle says no, this is an exercise to validate market interest and not the feature itself. Jan says the A/B test to test the pricing. And then Mervin, who said yes, says, well, this is a validation piece and the validation is present. And Nareg says, well, you want to know if this is solving a customer problem and that the customer is willing to commit and pay. In this case, yes. So some people say yes, some people say no. So here's the thing. As a product manager, again, or a founder, if your job is to validate that idea during discovery and de-risk it so that your team can go and build it, how is this not an MVP? You're validating exactly what you need to validate in the market. And yes, you can figure out, obviously, what solution is going to work for them thereafter and how it's going to work and use cases and show them demos. But from a validation point of view of you're going to your company as a product manager and say, hey, I've got this idea and I want us to invest in it. If you come back like Buffer did actually in real life with a giant lead list of people that want to use your product, and even on the 50% on the A/B test side, you know, they've got this pricing page, and if they can get, you know, information of like, 60% signed up for the premium model, 40% signed up on the standard plan. That's so much info and so much validation. I have a hard time understanding why this isn't an MVP and that valuation stage. And again, it's because MVPs have become a bit of a dirty word. But if we go back to empowering product teams and building trust in the system, well, then discovery, a core job of a product manager and product owner, if you're not doing that and in looking at tests in this manner, then, and you're using development to do that validation, if at any point you're building something to learn if we should have built it in the first place, you've gone wrong already. And that's why it's so important to try and call out, let's build the right thing the first time and validate whether it's the right idea in the first place. So that's kind of it for me. I'm going to open it up to Q&A. I think we've got just under 5 minutes here. Thanks for joining. I appreciate it. We had a pretty large turnout. Really awesome to see. And I just want to call out a couple of resources and a summary here. So number one, as I said before, I truly believe that product management and thus product ownership really should be the life cycle function of determining what is the next right thing to build in a fashion that minimizes risk for the entire company. A lot of resources and a lot of things that I called out here. There's a couple of books. Again, I'll share this deck afterwards and you'll be able to see it. But there's some awesome books that a lot of them call out some of the things that we talked about here as a whole. And yeah, we're hiring up Bananatag if anyone's interested. And if you're interested in learning more about product management, got BrainStation, they teach there. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. That was a fantastic presentation, Partho. What are your recommendations for prioritizing features? How do you prioritize features at Bananatag?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, features and ideas, the biggest piece that we try and look at, a lot of companies have used different models from ICE and RICE scores. I think the biggest piece is really aligning to where your company's trying to go, understanding, what your founders' needs are and what they're wanting out of the company, and then aligning your team's priorities to the OKRs or objectives or company objectives as a whole. So the first part to me is understanding those before diving into any kind of algorithm that exists out there for prioritization. And then I think the second piece is really, you have this track of ideas that are being validated. At Bananatag, a lot of our ideas are validated, very similar to our Scrum teams. They're done in sprints. They're done kind of separate from delivery. So we have a group of a team, and the team is working on delivering features, while the discovery team, let's call it, the trio or TPD, is validating ideas in a similar manner. So then the priorities come into the place of how validated and what confidence do we have that it's been validated, and then what's the overall impact. And by having development and engineering in that trio group or the TPD group, we're also getting estimation. So we're getting that level of effort. So you're trying to tie in as quick as possible. And that's when I think if you do that correctly, which a lot of companies and teams don't, then you can use a myriad of different prioritization, algorithms and exercises, whether it's RICE or even just simple, business value divided by level of effort. I think it's more the exercise of that discovery being done right, so that you can then prioritize quicker.
What is the framework you guys use at Bananatag for product discovery?
Yeah, I mean, the framework itself is, so it kind of ties into the prioritization side, but we've ran a couple of MVP experiments right now. One of our product managers had a really successful MVP where they used a kind of an app queue or a Pendo guide to basically build out a flow, just a prototype flow. And our expectation was like 50, 60 people of our company, 60 users may use this piece, and that was going to be validated. And we have a framework we call kind of a product canvas, which is a modified lean canvas That makes it really easy for product managers to highlight like what they want and what their pitch is and the target outcome and KPIs. And so when they do a lean experiment like this for discovery, they then basically get the outcome of whether or not they hit the goal or not. And in this one case, it was such a lean experiment, just, probably a day's worth of work with an AppQ or a guide or a Pendo guide. They got like 1,300 users using this flow, and expanding our product usage exponentially within less than 2 weeks, I think it was, or maybe it was under a month, which was phenomenal. We were expecting 50, and the number was 1,300. So, and you'll be able to call out failures the same way too. So, going back to your question, it ties into the prioritization side because our canvas that kind of documents that the product proposal then gets translated into our roadmap, which has an algorithm that's kind of a bit of our own secret sauce. It changes all the time. We have drivers that we call out of, do we think this is going to bring in net new MRR? Do we think this is going to, help us with expansion? Is this a, net retention play? And we kind of categorize that and improve it. And what's nice is with our roadmap tool, which we use Product Board and love Product Board, basically we can switch how heavy we weight those different drivers and priorities every quarter. So if one quarter we're really focused on, let's say, net expansion, then we can kind of say, I want expansion opportunities to be much higher. And that's how it helps with priorities and discovery.
What does your product toolkit look like? You talked about product, you talked about AppQs, you talked about Pendo. Let's hear it. What is that toolkit like end to end?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been told actually recently that we've got maybe a too sophisticated of a toolkit, but yeah, we use a couple of products. So number one, we use User Voice for our feedback tool. So we have our customer success teams and our sales teams and customers use User Voice to bring in feedback. I found that User Voice is probably one of the nicer kind of feedback tools, and so we use it just for that. And then we actually use Product Board for all of our road mapping and prioritization. We separate Product Board from Jira because when any product roadmap tool for me, whenever it gets connected to Jira, it becomes a very tactical tool, and it becomes, instead of it being a strategic product and tool, it's used as a day-to-day operation tool. So we make that separation. So Product Board's our roadmap tool. We feed in user voice feedback into our Product Board, and then we validate those ideas. Oftentimes we're listening about customer pain points, and customers always want to give a solution. So we try and look above that and say, okay, what's the actual problem that we're trying to solve? And then our data analysis tool is Pendo. So all of our product usage, and we've moved over to Pendo for all of our kind of guides and surveying, which used to be AppQs, but I think AppQs is a great product too. So those three products make up most of our toolkit: User Voice, Product Board, and Pendo. And now
how do you use Pendo specifically?
Yeah, Pendo's kind of, it's been tagged on most of our pages. We get a lot of our usage analytics, our segmentation analytics. We actually brought it in pretty recently, but I've used it in the past and use other variants of it too, like Heap. And I really like what Pendo's doing. They're bringing this kind of toolkit to product managers as a whole, where you can build out a survey or a new guide, and then you can segment, so you can segment right away people that fail the flow and see what else they're doing in that process. A really simple use case would be we can, have an NPS survey and then segment all the detractors. And you can do that all within a single tool. So that's pretty cool.
I like your philosophy and very similar to, we had Asana's chief product officer and we had Superhuman's founder a few weeks ago, and it's very sort of customer first, usability led development versus, hey, let's just write some specs and get developers taking a crack at it. In your opinion, what does a minimum viable product team at a startup look like?
Yeah, that's great.
Startup, let's say not sort of idea stage, but I've raised a seed round.
Sure.
What does my MVP product team look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, typically the tech lead role is sometimes relegated to someone that's a bit more senior. So if one of your founders is a technical person, it can be that person for a little while if you've just raised your seed round. And I think that the team itself is usually made up of, 3 developers. Maybe they're doing QA as well because they're doing automation. You can have a separate QA, and then a designer and a product manager. Now, if you're, just coming out of seed round, and depending on how large your seed round is, maybe the PM is, a founder, whether it's a CEO or a CPO founder. Your tech lead itself could be a CTO founder. Otherwise, you'll mix them in based on, what you don't have. But I don't think the team has to be that large to start with, 5, 6 people, and you have a really solid team that can move pretty quickly. And as you scale, you basically move forward and kind of look as a whole. I saw a question about the product canvas. I can definitely share that. It's a bit tweaked for what we do, but very similar to some of those as a whole.
How do you think about QA? Does QA sort of function in parallel to development where you're writing test cases and whatnot? Or like, how does that tie into the overall thing? Because you may have great product discovery and sign off on the interaction design before you build things. But like, if the thing doesn't work, then that's a problem. So how does QA fit into all of this?
Yeah, I think it does. I think that you do in this day and age, especially with, CI and CD. I think that it's much more automated, obviously. I think that, QA, we call them, they're engineers at our company. And they're writing a lot of those test cases and unit tests and the smoke tests ahead of time. They're doing it in parallel. And a lot of them are doing it with, like, when the specs are being written after the idea has been validated, that's being built out kind of at the same time. So I think that it has to evolve from where kind of manual regression testing used to be to much more in line with, the role I think is just a different type of developer and an engineer. I've seen them called automation engineers or QA engineers or software development and test. I think that's definitely the way to go, and that's how we run it at our company as well.
Awesome. That's all I had. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
I need some traction.